I'm happy to welcome you to the Something to Talk About program at the Bainbridge Island Senior Community Center. We do this Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Variety of topics. And today we will be talking with Robin Gaphni from Island Volunteer Caregivers about grief support. And today's program, as all of our Something to Talk About programs, is sponsored by Fieldstone Memory Care of Bainbridge Island. Fieldstone is offering innovative and compassionate care off Rolling Bay, and they are now accepting residents. If you'd like to schedule a tour of their beautifully appointed apartments, call 360-271-2530. Robin, thank you very much for joining us this blustery Monday morning.
Yes, thank you for having me. And I'm here to talk about grief support, one of my favorite things to talk about. But I thought I'll start with is what I'm going to tell a little bit about my journey, why I do this, and then head into what programs IVC offers, and then open it up to questions. Does that sound okay?
Great. That sounds wonderful. Thank you, Robin.
Okay, so and I know a couple of you on the call know this, but 11 years ago, last October 22nd, 2010, my oldest son, who was 21 at the time, died. And it was sudden, unexpected. He became quite sick. He was up at Western Washington University. He became sick. They didn't know what it was. And as it turned out, he had previously, we didn't know this, he had a bicuspid aortic valve, which only 2% of the population have. Most people have tricuspid. And the situation is, if you have a bicuspid, you are more likely to get infections. And so what happened is he got strep. They think he got it through a dental procedure. So he would have been one of those people that if we had known, he would have been given antibiotics prior to a dental thing, but we didn't know because he was a healthy kid. And he got sick, and the strep attacked his valve, which attacked his heart. And so in a period of 3 weeks, he went from various hospitals. He ended up at the University of Washington. They did a valve replacement, but the damage was done. So he survived the surgery, but died a week later. And it was, as you might imagine, the worst possible thing I've ever had to go through. Any of us had to go through. But as we humans are resilient and we continue on. And so my life was pretty dismal for about 18 months. And it was really hard to get up every morning, but we have 2 other kids, and we did it for them. And slowly, you begin to emerge from that darkness. And it so happened that a friend of mine who I was talking to said, she had been co-facilitating the grief support groups at IVC, and she needed to step back. And I was just beginning to kind of come out of where I was and figuring out what next. And I had been thinking that I wanted to work at hospice. And I actually had signed up to volunteer at hospice in Providence because they work directly with children's. And I thought at the time that that's where I wanted to put my energy, to helping families who were dealing with dying kids. But it turned out the very last day of the hospice training, it's very intense, it's like a whole weekend, was on grief. And it was like I had a eureka moment, like, oh, I don't want to deal with people who have dying kids. I want to deal with people post-death. And right as I finished that training, a friend of mine said, I don't have the time to do this anymore. And Karen Carson, who some of you may know, needs a co-facilitator. Would you be interested? And so serendipitously, it worked. And so I started, that was 9 years ago. I started with Karen, facilitating the grief support groups for IVC. And in the beginning, it's very different than what it is now. But in the beginning, they were drop-in grief support groups, which are really hard. And well, first of all, Karen kind of mentored me for about 4 months, and then she said she couldn't do it anymore. So I was on my own. And the minute that happened, I realized I can't do a drop-in group. It was just too difficult. So I started doing some training with a psychologist down in Colorado, and kind of learned and fumbled my way through those first years. And but the bottom line is, on the grief support group, and it's the same way now, is it's really about walking that path with others in the same kind of time period. So while I'm not in that anymore, I'm 11 years out, our groups are usually within 6 months to 12 months of the same of loss. And what is remarkable, at least what I see, what happens is that the members are the ones to help one another as they share their stories. What I do is I hold a space so that they feel safe and that it's a sacred space. So I'm going to talk about how the grief group has evolved the last 9 years, and then I'm going to talk about another program that we offer. So,
can I just interrupt
yeah,
for a second? Because
yes.
I'm wondering if you might talk a little bit about, in that journey that you went through, what did you realize might have been helpful, or what did you learn that was helpful, even though it wasn't with you that first 18 months?
Right. Well, and what I learned, thank you, Reed, that's a great question. What I learned, even during the 18 months, is I actually had a group of 3 other women. There were 4 of us who had lost kids during the same time frame. And they were who I relied on. But then we also had another woman who had lost her daughter to a pediatric cancer. She was 12, 3 years earlier. And what I learned, so on the one hand, I had a core group of women. We were kind of in this dark place together, but we had this other friend who was kind of doing amazing things, and she was 3 years further along. So she was like a light for all of us. Like, okay, she survived the unsurvivable. And so we did a lot, all of us, including her, Karen, excuse me, so that, and she really modeled, like, as bad as you think this is in the beginning, that you can't get up out of bed, she showed us that you could. So that's what I learned. That's why I saw the power of groups, and how, especially if it's grief without a lot of complications, it's just sad. It's just overwhelmingly sad. So then when I started doing the grief groups, in the beginning, like I said, they were drop-in, and then I made it so it wasn't drop-in, and I had a very pretty set book that we followed based on the teachings that I was learning in Colorado trainings. And it worked great. And I usually hold back in those days, I was doing 10-week groups. So I'd hold at least 2 a year. And then in 2018, I think, might have been 2019, I was approached by Blodell to say, hey, how would you like to lead a grief group in the tea house? And I was like, really? Well, that would be great. And they had made contact with a retired psychiatrist on the island, Ted Rainierson, who's been a longtime Virginia Mason doctor and ran a grief clinic over in Seattle. And it was mostly for traumatic grief, really sudden. They had groups for homicides and suicides, and it was quite different than what I was doing. And he was ready to kind of step away from that. And so Blodell put Ted and me together and said, how would you like to do this together? And so we said, sure. I mean, as you can imagine, leading a group in the tea house, it was part of their strolls program, if people know about that. So it was like wonderful to be able to have people either before the group or right after to then go off and walk Blodell. Because one thing I know, nature is incredibly healing. And so we were thrilled to do that. And we started off with a bang. We were able to lead 3 groups there, and we're getting ready for the next group, and the pandemic hit. So that was hard. And we did end up holding 3 Zoom grief groups during the pandemic, and they did work. They were small. We had to keep them small because you didn't want to have 10 or 11 people plus us on a screen. It was too much. We did that. And then in June, we started interviewing people, or, talking to people about the next group. We were all thrilled to be back at Bloedel because they were ready. And then the Delta variant, and then Bloedel said no. And so then we were like, oh, back to square one. But we felt, that's when I talked to Reed, and I said, listen, we have a group of 7 people that if they're fully vaccinated and willing to do this, and we wouldn't open it anymore, could we use the senior center? So I'm happy to say that this fall, we had a group that we have our last session this week on Thursday, and we've been in person again, and it's been great. It really, as much as I thought the Zoom works, and it does, we're Zooming right now. It's really nice to be in person, even though we're fully masked, and it works though. Yes, Reed.
So I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit about the pattern? So it sounds like the grief groups meet for a specific period of time.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, we meet for 8 weeks for 2 hours session. We have some, I think, really nice rituals that we do to kind of bring people into the space. We take a moment to kind of, do a very brief meditation just to center ourselves. And then everybody lights a candle for their loved one, which is it also brings them into the room also. And then as we move through the weeks, the first group is always the hardest because nobody knows each other. And, we're dealing with heavy subject matter. But the hope is that Ted and I create a space that as we move forward, people feel safe, and they do. And so what we usually, as we move through the weeks, we ask people to bring stories of who they were before. Right now we have all widows and widowers. It's difficult. We try and match losses. It's not always easy on Bainbridge because it's not a huge metropolis, but I try and, it's hard to bring, if we had all widows and then to bring in one bereaved parent, that can be difficult. So I tend not to do that just because oftentimes the bereaved parent, people feel just horrible for them. So anyway, in this case, we move through, then my favorite part of what we do is what we call the commemoration. And we have, everybody gets to bring pictures and stories of their loved one and to really introduce them to the group. And it's a very, what I like about it is that oftentimes, let's ignore COVID because that has brought up its own thing. But oftentimes people go through a funeral or a celebration of life in the early days, and you're a little bit raw and you're a little bit numb, and you don't really, you may put together a slideshow or whatever, but you're not really there. And what we have found when people do their commemorations is that they are so, it's really joyful. It's a really kind of a nice thing for people to share about their loved ones. And, all along though, just keeping in mind, even though we have a very set agenda, so to speak, as we move through the weeks, we also have open questions, and people will talk about, well, how do you deal with loneliness? Or how do you deal with, as one widow put it to me, YouTube is my friend because they're learning, oftentimes to do things that they hadn't had to do before. So there's a lot of kind of practical things that happen in a group too, as well as deeper things.
So have
So,
you had a chance to do that with your son? Matthew, is that his name?
Matthew, yeah, thank you. To do a grief group with,
Or no, to
the
do a
commemoration.
commemoration.
You know, that's a really good question, and I haven't. And I'll tell you, it I'm Jewish, and so in Judaism, they bury quickly and get it over with, because you then go into Shiva. And so yeah, and so it was, yeah, not my favorite day, or even looking back. So I haven't formally done it, although that group of women we've informally presented a lot to each other. And it does help, because you want them to know the person, especially because most of these people didn't know the people that they're talking about.
Yeah, and I can see how at a distance it allows you to
Yeah,
kind of really remember some of those precious moments without being totally
completely overwhelmed. Yeah, exactly. So there's no faces here except yours, Reed. So anyway, does anybody have questions? Because then if not, I will move on to another program that we do. But if anybody has questions about the grief group.
Well, I will ask you, please, if you might
Okay.
say what the pattern is if somebody was interested. How would they contact IVC, and whether they would be able to get in?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So if you were or knew of somebody who was interested, we would ask you to call IVC, and then they would connect you to me, and we would meet. And so depending on which program, and you'll hear about the next program in a minute, it would either be, if it's for a group, Ted and I would meet with you. And what that purpose is, to gauge a few things. It's to see, are you ready? Is this good timing? And you want to, sometimes it's too early, it's too early to be in a group you're not going to get from the group what you need to, and you might not be ready for it. So we meet, and you get to tell the story to the two of us. And if it's for the other program, you meet with me and another psychiatrist, who I'll talk about in a second. But then we would figure out when the next program is. Like I said, we're finishing up a program this week, and I'm anticipating the next program would be in February, probably. So.
Great. Any other questions? Okay.
So the other program we have came about 5 years ago, and we call it the Compassionate Companions Program. And this is one-on-one grief support. And it came out of, so one of my volunteers was a retired physician from the Bay Area, and she and her husband moved here, and he's a retired psychiatrist, and he had volunteered for 40 years at an organization in the Bay Area called CARA, and they did this one-on-one grief support. It's not therapy. It's very similar to kind of the group, but you're with a person who you're matched with, who is further down the grief journey. So CARA, the organization, was great and was really free. They lent us and let us use a lot of their materials, and we kind of handpicked some people in the community to go through as the first cohort. They're people mostly I know who were either had lost a child, or were widowed, or widowed, I think I can use, or had lost a parent, and they had the main criteria is the ability to be a very good listener, because as I said, it's not therapy, but what the program is it allows people to have a person that they can talk about, 10 months down the line, 14 months, and say, I'm still so sad. And they feel guilty. They don't want to bother their family or their friends. They feel like they've heard it. And so this person is there for them. And so it often starts out that it's the same process when somebody comes to IVC and says, well, I'm not interested in a group, I really want the one-on-one. Then John Rourke, he's the psychiatrist, he and I headed up, we meet with them, kind of hear their story, and then we figure out who of our trained people would be a good one to match with. And they, and so it oftentimes starts that it's more, they meet more frequently than they do in, you know, as it goes on. They'll meet once a week, might meet for coffee, they might go for a walk. And it's really just, and they, you know, they kind of set their boundaries and everything together, and then they move through. And then it gets, it's funny because it's hard because then oftentimes you become friends, and which is not hard, that's the good thing. But then it becomes that, you know, maybe 18 months down the line, you realize that it's not really, it is a friendship now, it's not compassionate companions, and the person doesn't need it anymore. So
I'm wondering about that, like, that sounds like it might be somewhat open-ended, or is there sort of
it is.
Some structure where you say, we're going to check in with you after 3 months? And
it's more open-ended, and we're learning, kind of learning our way through it. Most times it kind of organically evolves to the point where it's not needed anymore through IVC, and then sometimes it's just done, you know, the person's done, and other times they're friends, and that's it. The beauty, what I love about the Compassionate Companions program in particular, is that because you typically only run 2 grief groups a year, this program can start anytime. So it's nice. So if I get a call, you know, this week, and I say, well, yeah, we are going to have a group, but it probably won't be till late February, but I have another program if you're interested now, that they can get a person. And we sometimes do have, actually quite often we have people doing both programs. So.
And can you tell me a little bit about who is, if people are interested in considering being one of the compassionate companions, what the training's like? Yeah. How you get involved in that way?
Yeah, thank you. The training is usually done, you know, I'm trying to think, is it 12 hours of training that we do on the weekends? We've trained 2 cohorts. We're about to train a 3rd, and I think we're full. I think we're, and for this particular one, it was looking at what do we need? Well, we knew we needed a widower, because we had a widower and he moved away. So we needed that. The bereaved parent, we had now some bereaved dads. I needed somebody who had suicide. So we try and look at the holes we might have so that we can match as best as possible. So that's how it works.
And I'm guessing that for somebody who is down that grief journey, this, as it has been for you, can be a really wonderful way to continue to heal.
Exactly. And that's the thing that's been so amazing, is when people who, you know, even 2 years ago would never have been able to do something like this, are now able to be so present for somebody who's much newer on the grief journey. So it's not like that other, you know, the volunteers getting as much out of it in many times as the, what we call care receiver. So yeah.
Which is the story of IVC all the time anyway.
I know.
Right?
That is true. And you know, just a quick word about grief. You know, I don't think we, meaning US society, does it very well. And so, you know, people get 3 days bereavement leave, and then they're supposed to buck up and get back to work. And that's not how it always was. It used to be, if you think back 100 years ago, if you had a widow or somebody who lost a child, they wore black for a year. I mean, everybody acknowledged and knew that this person was in mourning. And we've kind of lost that along the way. And so what I like about what IVC does is that it recognizes that you can't just say 3 days later, obviously, that you're going to be okay. And so we're giving people permission to not be okay and to share their stories, because I think that's the best way to help people get better. So
now, if there's somebody who's watching this who is not sure that they, well, it sounds like one thing is just to reach out to you and see what might be available through IVC. But are there other resources in our county that you've run across that might also be useful? Just sort of anecdotally?
Definitely, there are for sure. So first of all, and I'm still in the process, COVID has done a number on therapists. Either they've retired or they're completely full. So one of the things I'm trying to put together is a new list of people, the grief therapists, people who deal with grief. And we often can have people who are going through a group, but they also feel like they need a little more than a compassionate companion. They actually need some therapy. So there are resources there. There are also, there used to be on a Thursday, there was a survivors of suicide at Harrison. And I think I often will, for suicide, refer out because that is more complicated and it's not usually, sometimes not great for the mix of a group. Helpline, Gina Capel runs grief groups for more complicated grief. So if somebody comes through and it's probably not the best match for an IVC grief group, we'll refer to Helpline, specifically to Gina, and she does groups and she also does counseling. So there are all sorts of resources. I have to admit, I'm not sure what all is available now with COVID because things have changed.
I think that that one of the challenges really must be where to turn when there's nowhere to turn. Yeah. And so knowing that at least there's a phone call to you to at least get the conversation started, I think is a wonderful thing that you're doing for IVC and for the community. We're all appreciative of that.
Well, and I'm appreciative to being at the senior center right now. So,
well, here's hoping you get back to the tea house soon.
Well, not that the senior center is not great, but the tea house, I hope we do too. I just don't. We'll wait and see, won't we?